Can you hear me, Steve? Yep, I think you can. Good. Yeah. You ready? Okay, great. Good evening. Glad to see some of you guys brave the warm weather today to come out. We are looking at, we've finished up last week looking at the Roman trials. We're going to look at the very last piece of that tonight, a little piece of that, and then we're going to go into what's going to happen on the way to the cross. We're going to look at some of that. And probably by next week, we'll actually get to the crucifixion. So by Easter, we may get to the resurrection. Who knows? Might be just time just perfect. Never know. So when we look at the passages we're going to look at tonight here about Jesus being mocked, this is a particular time that he's mocked. We're going to talk about some others. And as we go through the crucifixion, I want you to keep your eye out for the times that Jesus gets mocked in addition to what we're going to talk about tonight, because there's quite a bit. So when we look at the Gospels, one of the things that we realize is that the Gospels are really pretty silent when it comes to talking about what a crucifixion really is, what it looks like, what the physical torture Jesus endured was. You know, it wasn't until Mel Gibson came out with his movie that we really had a really good visual of what crucifixion was kind of like. And I don't know if you're like me, I kept my eyes closed during most of that movie, so I didn't really even see all of it. But you could hear it, and that was enough. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that it... Oh, they can't hear. I think they can't hear on the thing. Do we need to wait?
I don't know. He says he can hold it on his.
Oh.
Mommy and Armin said it was enough. Can you get it, Mommy? No signal, so maybe it's on their end.
It's probably on their end then.
Because they're on YouTube, it's going fine.
Oh, it's going fine on yours. Okay, okay. I hate that because they faithfully listen every Monday night. Okay, so why do you think it is that the Gospels are silent on the torture involved in a crucifixion? Why do you think that it doesn't give us all that information? What do you think? No idea? Yeah, it was a shameful way of being crucified, but that goes right along with what prophecy said, doesn't it? Yeah. But it might surprise you, the reason that they didn't use any ink talking about the crucifixion is because it was so stinking common that every person living in the Roman Empire had probably witnessed several crucifixions. Isn't that amazing? They needed no description to know what a crucifixion looked like, sounded like, smelled like. They didn't need that, all right? From 400 BC, okay, 400 years before Christ was born, up until 33 AD, the estimates for Roman crucifixions, or crucifixions, not just Roman, because 400 years prior would also have been the Greeks and the Persians as well. The estimates range from 300,000 to 2 million crucifixions, yes. Sometimes, as Christians, we think that Jesus might be the only guy who was ever crucified, because that's the only one we ever hear about. Not true, not true. Most of the time, it was slaves who were revolting. Rome chose not to execute their own citizens. It was such a barbaric practice that if you were a Roman citizen, you could be executed, but you were exempt from crucifixion unless you were a soldier who had deserted, or you were a Roman citizen who was an insurrectionist or who had supported trying to assassinate Caesar or whatever. So there were a few exceptions, but by and large, crucifixion was reserved for people who did not have Roman citizenship. A lot of those folks would have been slaves. The rest of them would have been people like the Jews who, you know, even though they're free, they're not Roman citizens, okay? Probably the most famous, Mike?
I know this popped in my mind. How did they bury these people
They didn't. The majority of the people were left on, because it was considered a shameful execution and a shameful death. If the family went to the ruler, wherever they were at, the king or whoever they were at, and got permission to take the body for burial, then they could bury the body. Most often, the bodies were left, a lot of times that was denied, okay? Most often, the bodies were left on the crosses to be eaten by animals and birds, as a reminder to people that this is what's going to happen to you if you go against Rome, okay?
Priest, I asked that, you mentioned slave or
Yes, yeah, nobody would
slave owner
bother. Nope,
bury his
nope, you're right.
slave or whatever.
Nobody would bother with them, yeah. So part of the whole idea, there were two main ideas behind crucifixion. One was humiliation, removal of all dignity of the person being crucified, okay? And number two, it was to be a deterrent from anyone else ever to try to do what that person did, which is why they always made them wear around their neck or on the cross the title of their crime. Okay, so to tell people that if you do this too, this is what's going to happen to you, and you won't even get an honorable burial. And in most cultures of the world, burying the dead is an act of honor. It's an act of dignity, final dignity. And to leave a human body just to be eaten by animals and birds and hang there for days and days and rot on a cross, basically, okay, is the ultimate indignity. And that's part of the whole idea of crucifixion. It was designed to be cruel. It was designed to be humiliating. It was designed to remove all dignity. Probably the most famous mass crucifixion was Spartacus. You've probably read the book or seen a play or seen a movie about Spartacus. He was a slave who got 100,000 other slaves to revolt against Rome, okay? And he humiliated the Roman army on multiple occasions with his victories, but then when he was defeated, he was killed in battle. There were 6,000 of his soldiers remained after the battle was over, and 6,000 soldiers were executed. They were executed on a road between Rome and a town called Capua, where he was from. 120 miles worth, 6,000 crosses on that road. Because it was to be a deterrent to crime and because it was to be humiliating, they were never done in an isolated place. They most often were done on a busy crossroad. So if you were traveling anywhere, to get anywhere, you most likely would pass multiple crucifixions if you lived in the Roman Empire. That's really the reason why they don't talk about it very much in the scriptures. They didn't need to. Everybody knew what that was, and they knew what it looked like. So when Jesus was telling his disciples, if I be lifted up, they knew exactly what he meant. They knew what being lifted up meant. They knew it was crucifixion. He said, if I be lifted up, I draw all men to myself, right? And so there was really no need to go into detail or explain. Another one, Herod the Great, okay? He's the one who killed the baby boys in Bethlehem or whatever. He died in 4 BC, I know the calendar is off by 4 or 5 years, 6 I think actually, but he died in 4 BC, and his death sparked a Jewish revolt, a messianic revolt. They were glad to get rid of that guy, and they were hoping for the Messiah to come, and there was a revolt of Jews, and so General Varus of the Roman army came in, and in one day crucified 2,000 people from Judea. 2,000, right? That's right about the time Jesus is born. Common thing, okay? So the Gospels don't emphasize the physical agony, they don't emphasize the gruesomeness, they don't emphasize what it was like, or not much detail at all, but they all do emphasize one thing, commonly, all 4 Gospels. Brock?
So what about the Sabbath and stuff? They leave them hang there anyway?
No, they did not. Jewish people got a lot of concessions from the Roman government because they were so hard to control, because they kept rioting. The Roman army, for example, every male in the Roman Empire is expected to serve in the Roman army except Jewish men, okay? They were given an exemption. Jews did not have to serve. in the Roman army. Jews were allowed to worship only their one God, and everybody else had to worship Caesar and everybody else, but they didn't hold the Jews to that. In fact, you remember, that's one of the reasons Pilate got in trouble. He kept trying to force the Jews to have images of Caesar on their shields and images of Tiberius on all the Caesars and all the pagan gods and everything, and he kept getting in trouble for that. So the Jews had a lot of exceptions to the rules, okay? And one of them, if it interfered with their religious holidays, the Romans had to back off. So the fact that Jesus would be, the Jews did not allow a dead body to hang on a cross during high holy days like Passover, all right? That was considered against their religious beliefs, which if you go back to the Old Testament, it is. That is part of their law. So those bodies would have been taken off the cross and thrown into the dump that is in the Kidron Valley just south of Jerusalem, right outside the city limits. It's where Jesus talked about it being Gehenna, where the worm never dies and the fire never goes out. It's a garbage dump. And so if a family didn't come to get their body or didn't get permission, instead of letting them rot, if there was going to be a Sabbath day, they got thrown into that pit. Yeah, no dignity whatsoever, all right? So what is it that all four of the Gospels do emphasize, if it's not the crucifixion? When we talk about Easter, we seem to focus, don't we, on the physical agony of Christ, what he endured for us, how awful that was that he would go to the cross for us. Nothing wrong with that. But we're missing the point of what the Gospels emphasize. All four of them emphasize his humiliation. They emphasize the things that people do to him that strip him of all dignity. The mockery, the taunting, it's incessant. Jesus put up with a lot of that through his ministry, remember? They called him crazy. They said that he did his miracles by the power of Satan. They called him a bastard child, okay? So he put up with a lot of that during his ministry as well. And the crucifixion, it's really heightened. We saw during the Sanhedrin trials, the very people who are supposed to be upholding Jewish law and the dignity of human beings, the high priests, the scribes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, what do they do to Jesus during the trial? What did they do? They testified against him. During the Jewish trials, especially the one at night before the morning one, they put a hood over his head, remember? And they slapped him and said, "You prophet, prophesy. Prophesy, tell us who hit you. Tell us who's going to hit you next. You're supposed to be a prophet. Tell us." And they beat him bloody. Then they spit on him. Remember that? Today, if you spit on somebody, you can be charged with assault by bodily fluid. Did you know that? Then if you spit on a police officer, you're going to jail. Okay? It's considered assault. In the Middle Eastern culture, you can multiply that by 100, okay? Because they consider that to be the worst thing you can do to somebody is to spit on them. And Jesus, we're going to see, he got spit on by the religious leaders. And he's going to get spit on by everybody else along the way here, okay? So we start out with the Sanhedrin mocks him and does that. We saw that he got taken from Pilate to Herod. What did Herod's men do to him? Herod and his private army of his bodyguards. Do you remember when they went to King Herod, what did they do? When Jesus wouldn't talk to King Herod, what did they do? Do you remember? It's been just a couple weeks ago, y'all. What's that? Yeah, they put on a glorious robe, a white kingly robe on him, and mocked him as a king, and then they beat him about the head and face and spit on him and sent him back to Pilate. Okay? So now we're ready for what's going to happen under Pilate. And sometimes, if you read just Mark or Matthew, you might think that the scourging and this mocking were all the same event, but there's actually a pause in between there, and we see that in John. So it kind of helps us to look all three of them to set the order right. So last week we looked at the fact that, or 2 weeks ago, I think, because last week we talked about who killed Jesus. When Pilate keeps trying to get the Jewish people who are wanting him dead, He's trying to give Jesus an out because he keeps saying, this man's innocent. He's innocent. He passed his verdict multiple times, but they wouldn't accept it. And they're threatening him and all of that. So during one part of it, he tries to make deals with them. And so at one point in it, he says, all right, I'll have him punished, I'll have him scourged, and that ought to be enough, okay? And so that's where we are tonight. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 27 first, verses 26 through 33. So if you want to turn there. This is right after one of his other attempts to make a deal with the Jewish people fell flat on its face. He pulls out a murderer, an insurrectionist, and says, here's this guy, and here's this pitiful guy who's been beat up by the Sanhedrin, who's been beat up by Herod's men, who's bloodied and bruised and looks terrible. He doesn't look like any kind of threat to anybody. He doesn't look like a king. He shows no power. He's not even defending himself. He might be off in the head, okay? So here's him, and here's this murderer. Who do you want me to release to you as your Passover scapegoat? And they scream for Barabbas. And that's where we start in Matthew. Then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, this is when he sends Jesus to the soldiers to be beaten. We talked about scourging a couple of weeks ago. Several strips of leather with bone, rock, glass, anything sharp that they can whittle down, metal, and they only quit beating him when they got too tired or too bored with it to stop. There's no limit. One of the things I found that was interesting is that all crucifixion victims were scourged first, except for women. Women were not, okay? And senators, women and senators. If a senator was an insurrectionist or something was going to be crucified, then he didn't have to be scourged. Lots of people died from scourging and never made it to the cross. So you think about that number of 300,000 to 2 million people who did get crucified, and then there's all these others who died before they could even get there because of the brutal treatment that they received. All right, so this is after Jesus has been scourged, and so in Matthew it says the next thing happens, he delivers him to be crucified. But it says, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole garrison around him. All right, the word for garrison here is the cohort. That is 1/10 of the legion, so it's 600 soldiers. So you've had this group of soldiers whose duty it is that day to scourge prisoners, okay? And they've done their thing with Jesus. And then now, Jesus is being taken into the praetorium, just means he's inside Herod's palace, probably in an archway area, okay? It's not very far from where the Jewish people have been, and he's been trying to get this verdict across to them that he needs to be released. But now they invite all of the soldiers to come and witness what they're going to do next, okay? This was before a crucifixion, but part of in this instance is because Jesus looks so helpless. One of the Roman historians talking about the lack of concern for human life in the Roman Empire. And you think about the gladiator games, okay, and all the other games that went on. The Roman citizens were hardened to the loss of blood. They saw it all the time. It didn't faze them. They weren't overly concerned when people's blood got shed. It wasn't really a big deal. You kind of see that in our culture today with the movies that we have and the video games that we have, and it's like they have to try more and more to shock us with how gruesome they can make a murder anymore. But one of the Roman historians was saying that one of the characteristics of Roman soldiers and their brutality was that they often, when they're bored, made sport of mentally deranged boys and men. Okay? If they saw them out in the street or whatever, then they had free rein to mock them, beat them, tease them, make fun of them, do whatever they wanted to do, strip them. It didn't matter. okay? And that was part of the mentality of the brutality of the Roman soldiers. So here they're taking Jesus, and they gather the whole garrison around, 600? The whole garrison, even if some of them had to stay on duty, we're still looking at a big crowd. So this is kind of like an entertainment event here. It's kind of entertainment event for the soldiers. And they all gather around him. Now, not every single one probably took part in this, but a lot of them did, because you all know about mob mentality, right? But you also all know about male testosterone, right? When one the old joke that if there's one teenage boy in a room, the IQ's here. If you put two in, both their IQs drop to here. If you put 6 in here, the IQ's not even readable, okay? Because they have this group idea. If one says something, I'm going to one-up you. It's the idea of, here, hold my beer while I do this, It's that testosterone thing. It's kind of the things they probably wouldn't do on their own, but they will do under the influence of a whole group of guys. So here's what they did. It says they stripped him naked, okay? That puts me in mind of cruel things that happen in boys' locker rooms, at least back in the 70s when I was in school, okay? They stripped him naked. They put a scarlet robe on him. Now, Mark's going to say purple, and I think John does too. The idea is that soldiers wore a scarlet robe, and they got faded by the sun, and they turned to this maroon purplish color, okay? So it's an old robe. So it's not anything comfortable. Put a scarlet robe on him. When they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, the King of the Jews." Then they spat on him, took the reed, struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they took the robe off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him away to be crucified. We're not given any amount of time there. It's whenever they decided they were done, okay? When we look at this, the whole idea here is that they are mocking him as a king. They've heard, his crime. He's trying to be a king of the Jews. You're trying to be a king when Caesar's the only king? Well, here, let's see what kind of king you are. And remember what he looks like at this point. His eyes are probably swollen shut. He's bloodied. He's bruised. He's beaten. We saw that the Sanhedrin mocked him as a prophet. Now, these guys are going to mock him as a king, okay? So, already the Sanhedrin, already Herod. So he gets a crown, this crown of thorns. There's all kinds of different kind of thorny bushes and things that grow around Palestine. A lot of different people have tried to determine what kind it was. There's no real idea and no definitive answer on what kind it was. But the thorns around Judea range from 1/2 inch to 12 inches long. So I don't know what kind of they had, but whatever it was, they twisted this into a crown and then they pounded onto his head. And you can imagine what kind of damage that would do. Okay? But it's supposed to represent, it's a mockery, it's supposed to represent, because Caesar always wears a gold, it's made of gold, but it's a laurel leaf crown. So it goes around the head, okay? So it goes, and that's where we get the image of the crown of thorns going around his head. So that's supposed to be a symbol of a king. And then they hand him a reed. Now, when I think of reed, I'm thinking of a pond reed, a marshy reed. They're pithy on the inside. You can't do a lot of damage with them. But the Hebrew word, or the Greek word, the Greek word here for reed is stick, okay? It's a club. It's a stick. And so they hand him that as a scepter in his right hand, because that's where a king holds his scepter, right? In his right hand. Then they bow before him, they bow the knee before him, and they're saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." Because when they see Caesar as soldiers, or anybody above them, they are expected to bow the knee. Hail Caesar, here, hail King of the Jews. So the whole thing is a mockery about the fact that he's claiming to be a king. And then notice from that, they go, "Yeah, you're not much of a king," and they begin to spit on him, and they take the stick and they beat him around the head with it, okay? If we go to, hang on a second. Oops. Why are you not moving? Okay, let me go here. When we go to Mark, let's look at what Mark says. So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified. Then the soldiers led him away to the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole garrison. So pretty similar so far. They clothed him with purple. They twisted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and began to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews. So saluting him, that's part of the homage to the king. Then they struck him on the head with a reed and spat on him, and bowing the knee, they worshiped him. Because you remember, for the Romans, Caesar is a god. So this is all a parody of pretending that Jesus thinks he's a king, okay? And it says again, when they'd mocked him. Now, it's very clear in the Greek and the Roman that the verb tense basically says, they struck him and kept striking him on the head and with a reed, and they kept spitting on him over and over and over, and they kept bowing the knee, and they kept worshiping. That this is not just a one-time thing and we're done, which makes sense when you've got all that many guys. How many of them want to get in on the act, right? So several of them, I would think, would be content to sit back and watch and make rude comments, but others want to get in on it, and so it's continual. I can't imagine how many different people must have spit on him. How many people hit him? And so he's just being beaten about the head with this stick, okay? Now, when we look at John 19, John puts it in order for us, okay? Because both in Matthew and Mark, it basically says, and then he went out to be crucified. But in here it says, so then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, Hail, King of the Jews. So far, we haven't learned anything new. And it says, and they struck him with their hands. That means that they were beating him also with their fist, probably seeing who could knock his teeth loose, who could, bloody his nose, break a nose, who knows. But then it says, Pilate then went out again and said to them, Behold, I'm bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. So after scourging, he brings him out. After this mockery, he's bringing him out again. Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Behold the man. So that shows us that the Jews got to see what Jesus looked like after he was scourged, and then after he's taken all of this abuse. Beard full of spit, blood all over him, and swollen beyond what you would think, okay? It says, therefore, when the chief priests and the officers saw him, Pilate is hoping that at this point, they might have some sense of humanity, some sense of compassion, some sense of guilt over what they're creating, enough so that they will agree that he's been punished enough, let him go. But that's his mistake. They could care less. Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate says, You take him and crucify him, because I find no fault in him. Multiple times, Pilate says, He's innocent, he's innocent, and he's innocent. And when it's at the end, he really makes the Jews declare his sentence. Pilate never does. He makes them declare it, and they declare it loud and repeatedly. Crucify him, we have no king but Caesar. Let his blood be on us and on our children. Okay? All right, so let's go back and look at this a little bit. In Mark chapter 10, way back, okay, when Jesus is talking to the disciples, one of the things he tells them, when they get to Jerusalem, he goes, they will mock him and scourge him and spit on him and kill him, and the third day he will rise again. So this is not anything that Jesus is surprised about. The disciples shouldn't have been surprised either, because Jesus told them all the way back in chapter 10, pretty much in detail, what's going to happen. I'm going to be mocked, I'm going to be scourged, I'm going to be spit on, and then I'm going to be crucified, just like everybody else who gets crucified. That's what he's telling them. But the difference here is, he says, on the third day I will rise. If you look back at Isaiah, 700 and some years before this, okay, Isaiah the prophet chapter 50, verse 6. I offered my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who tore out my beard. And we didn't actually hear the gospel writers mention that, but Isaiah mentions it. Does it surprise you that the soldiers would have been pulling out his beard, plucking out his hair, yanking his hair? No. Here's the part that's shocking. I did not hide my face from scorn and spittle. Jesus didn't duck. He didn't hide. He took it. Why? Because all of this is part of paying the price for mine and your sin, because it's prophesied. And so he takes it quietly, which is, one of the authors said that's probably one of the reasons that the soldiers decided that he was probably mentally deranged, because Jesus never speaks during all of this. He never says anything. If you go up a couple chapters to Isaiah chapter 52, the prophet is saying, just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness. That's pretty graphic. After they were through with him, he didn't look human anymore. His face was unrecognizable. Wow. I want to read you a couple of things from one of the commentaries. A couple of notes that I had in here, but then I want to read a quote to you. One of the things that that was interesting, that the idea, it says, although these soldiers were under orders from Pilate to scourge Jesus, they're still guilty, because they take it so much way beyond just a scourging. They go, their wickedness exceeds what was the basics of what was required to obey their orders, okay? They take it to the max. When we look at the Roman soldiers here, because Roman soldiers would not want to do this to their own citizens, Roman, I don't know what you call them, in their whatever platoons are now, maybe cohorts or whatever, you were never assigned to your home country. You were assigned to a different location where you didn't care about the people, so you could be brutal, so you could do those things. But they usually assigned you to a country that spoke either the same language or a similar language, okay, because it would make their job that much easier. Most theologians believe that most of the soldiers here, we know they're not Jewish because they don't have to serve in the military, but most theologians believe that the soldiers here were from Syria, that they were probably Syrian soldiers. So, that's the Damascus area up north of Israel, and they've been at war for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? Okay. They would have all spoken Aramaic. That's why that was the common language of that area, so that's why it was probably from there. Pilate didn't tell them, he didn't initiate the mockery, but Pilate had a reputation for being very cruel, so he probably enjoyed it. He probably he obviously didn't try to put a stop to it. He obviously didn't limit it, so he didn't oppose it at all. So, it's just one more. He's done a lot of cruel things. He was known for being merciless. Mike?
Would the Romans have did this to someone, say Barabbas?
Sure.
They were crucified yet. Would they have done the same type of
Yeah.
acts to him as they did to Jesus?
Yes, the biggest thing that the Romans crucified people for was anything that they thought was a threat to Caesar. So,
Barabbas, he was an insurrectionist,
yes,
murderer, so they probably would have.
definitely, because he's definitely trying to overthrow Rome. So yeah, they would, yeah. So part of the mockery of it is all about, it's all to deter other people. Brock?
Do we know the census, how many people were there at that time in Rome?
In Rome?
Well, just like you said, there was 300,000 to a million,
2 million.
2 million crucifixions.
That's in 400 years. Yeah, from 400 BC up till the time of Jesus. That was the one number I was able to find, a time period for. Yeah.
Commentaries, many books talk about
What the population was? Well, Rome was pretty huge, so I'm sure there's a lot. Covered how many major cities? Tons and tons of people. Well, you kill 6,000 slaves one day, and you kill 2,000 Jews another, all by crucifixion. They didn't have any qualms with killing large groups of people. And if you study Roman history about all of the wars they were constantly in, one of the reasons they had to keep expanding and keep getting slaves because they needed more and more people to backfill their armies. I mean, you had tons of battles, and I don't know why men do this, but the kind of battles where you line up and you face each other and then you charge at each other. And I'm like, that is the dumbest way to fight I've ever seen. I don't understand that. In our country, the Revolutionary War was like that. I don't get that. The Civil War is like that. Bad idea in my book. All right, the part I wanted to read to you is this. It's kind of long, but I thought it was good. It's talking about the soldiers. So they had nothing personal against Jesus. He was simply another condemned prisoner whom they were free to abuse as much as they pleased. What they did to him was unrelated to religious or personal animosity. Their torment of Jesus was wicked and inexcusable, but it was done out of spiritual ignorance. They didn't, it wasn't because they thought anything religious about Jesus, right? Jesus' face was swollen from the slaps and beatings he received from the temple police and was covered with spittle from his Jewish tormentors. He was bleeding profusely from the scourging, with terrible lacerations from his shoulders down, exposing muscles, ligaments, blood vessels, and perhaps even internal organs. Because he had not spoken for the last hour or so, the soldiers may have considered him mentally deranged and worthy only of ridicule. They played him as the fool, making sport of the comments they had overheard about his claim to kingship. It did not matter to them that Jesus had never personally harmed them, or that technically he was innocent according to Roman law. They'd been trained to obey orders, which frequently required killing and torture. Jesus had been officially condemned, and there was no sense of justice or propriety, much less of mercy or compassion, tempered their cold-hearted entertainment at Jesus' expense. Although in an extreme way, they expressed the natural wickedness of every human heart that is ignorant of God.
Google said the population at Jesus' birth was 300 million
In the Roman Empire?
on the earth.
On the earth, 300 million. So there'll be plenty in that Roman Empire because it was huge. Oh. Thank you for doing that. All right, so what else I think that's all I want to tell you about the soldiers. So that's one group of people that we see involved in Jesus' crucifixion. And you would probably have to say that they are the ignorant, wicked people, okay? They don't have an axe to grind with Jesus. They don't hate him. There's no hatred involved here. They're just brutal. Very, very brutal. Yeah. What they've trained to be, what they enjoy. That's their culture. If you think about the gladiator games, and you see women and children screaming to kill people, and cheering when the blood is shed and all that. Wow. Okay. Ignorant, wicked people. Okay, so we're going to see a lot of other characters in the crucifixion, and it's interesting that the gospel writers include these people. They are significant, so because they got included, so we know they're significant, right? And so we're going to look at a few of those people as we go, okay? First one we're going to look at, Matthew 27, verse 32. You've probably heard of this guy before. The guy's name is Simon, which is a very, very common Jewish name, not Greek, it's Jewish, because one of Jacob's 12 sons was Simeon, right? Simon is the Greek name for Simeon. So a lot of Jewish boys would have been named Simeon, okay? And at first it seems like this is just a random choice by Roman soldiers, and they have no particular reason for choosing him, but you can see God's providence at work behind this, that this is not such a random choice. God not only is orchestrating the crucifixion of his own son, and not only orchestrating the salvation of all sinners who will ever live, but the salvation of those sinners, but he's also orchestrating the lives of individuals, which is kind of cool when you think about it. So it says, now as they came out, this is when they're done mocking him and they're ready to take him to the cross. As they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. And when they had come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, place of the skull, what did I do with the next part of it? I think I stopped there because it goes on and it starts about the crucifixion. So it's Simon of Cyrene. We know that he gets chosen to help carry Jesus' cross. One of the parts of the Roman crucifixion law was that the condemned person had to carry their own cross, okay? For some reason, probably because Jesus had lost so much blood, maybe he was in so much pain, he was in such a weakened condition, he's not been asleep all night, he's undergone 6 trials, okay? For some reason, he needs help carrying this cross, all right? He's in his condition. Some scholars say, well, crucifixions were so popular that the posts were always in the ground at crossroads on busy highways, and so they just carried the crossbeam piece. But the word in the Greek sounds like it's the whole thing, so there's arguments over what it was, and I don't really think that's the important part. The important part is this guy. The important part is Simon, okay? Not exactly what he carried, but who he is and what happens here. So Cyrene is a settlement along the Mediterranean coast on the northern part of Africa. It's in what's now Libya, Tripoli, that area there. It's directly south of Greece. It's just west of Alexandria, Egypt. Alexandria was a very, very busy city, had a huge Jewish population, lots of Jewish synagogues there, several universities there. It was known for its libraries, a lot of intelligent people from Alexandria. Cyrene is just a little bit west of there. Simon is obviously Jewish. He's named after Simeon. And he's most likely come there for Passover. So we get the idea that he is a practicing devout Jew. All right, he's there for Passover, and he gets chosen out of the crowd to carry the cross. Luke says, now as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, okay? That means they put hands on him. The Roman army had total control over every Roman citizen. Remember when Jesus said, if a soldier asks you to carry his pack 1 mile, carry it 2? That's because they could tell you to stop whatever you're doing and do whatever they wanted you to do at any time in your life. One of the reasons they were so hated, okay? So they lay hold of this Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. Now, Mark gives us some information that the other two don't. It says, they compelled a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as he was coming out of the country and passing by to bear his cross. Okay? I have some notes back here. Talking about Cyrene, it was a very prosperous trade center, had a large population of Jews. I already told you that. Why do you think they chose him? If you were a Roman soldier and you needed somebody to carry this cross, who would you pick out of the crowd? A big dude, exactly. So he probably was somebody who looked strong. He looked big, he looked strong, and so they had him grab the cross. But Simon's life is probably going to take a change here. Okay, so Mark not only tells us that his name and where he's from, but he tells us who his children are. So that's got to be significant, right? What is different about Mark's gospel from the other 3 gospels? What is it about Mark's gospel that's different than Matthew, Luke, and John? What's that? No, not. In fact, he probably knew less because he wasn't a disciple. He got all his information secondhand. They didn't mention that he was their father, no, in the other 2 at all. But why would Mark? Who did Mark write to? Who is his gospel written for? Do you remember? What? Yeah, Romans. His gospel is written to the Gentiles, to the Romans. His gospel is written, do you think it's to unbelievers or believers? Believers. The whole New Testament's written to believers, y'all. It's not written for unbelievers, okay? So he's writing to believers, Roman believers, most likely the church in Rome, okay? He's writing to believers in Rome. So if you're writing to a certain group of people and you happen to say, this guy is the father of Alexander and Rufus, what is he trying to tell them? Yeah, this is your people. You know this guy. You might not know him, but you know his kids. You know Alexander and Rufus who are in that church. So knowing that Mark is written between 50 and 60 AD, okay, 50 and 60, all right? At that point in time, we already know that there is a church in Rome because Paul writes a letter to the Romans at about that same time, okay? And so we know that there is a church there in Rome, that there are believers there are Christians there. Mark writes his letter to the Romans. Look at Romans chapter 16, verse 13. Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me as well. Wow. Now, Rufus is not that common of a name. Now, Alexander, very, very common. Why? Alexander the Great, obviously, okay? So, and they're just a little bit west of Alexandria, Egypt. I imagine a lot of the boys in that neighborhood. How many girls do you know named Shelby? Right? So, yeah, this kid was named Alexander, and his brother's name was Rufus. And Paul says, greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, meaning he's a believer. Greet him and his mother. Who would that be? Yeah, Simon from Cyrene's wife. They're now in Rome, worshiping in this church in Rome. And Paul says, and she's been like a mom to me. So Paul has a very, very close relationship. Now, when we see Simon from Cyrene, he's just another Jewish guy in the crowd, right? There for Passover. But something happens. Somewhere along the line, his kids become a believer. What's that tell you? And his wife, so what's that tell you? Yeah, yeah. Carrying this cross changed not only him, but his family and generations down the road, right? Yeah. So I think it's included because, well, for one thing, Mark knows there's people that knows him, that knows this. But the whole idea here is that in the middle of God orchestrating all the details to have his son crucified at the exact right moment, okay? Because if you think about it, why did they make Jesus carry this cross? I mean, why did they make Simon carry Jesus' cross? They were being impatient for some reason, right? I mean, they could have drug it out and made him carry it all day, no matter how long it took him, right? But that would not have fit in with God's plan to have him crucified by 3 p.m. when the lambs are being crucified. Think about that. All of these moving pieces, and our mighty God can work them all. And in the middle of all that, here's Simon that he chooses. The Roman soldiers think they chose him. But it's obvious from that being included in here, God chose him. Because God had something going on for Simon, too, in the middle of everything else. Look at in Acts chapter 6, verse 9. It said, then some of those who belonged to the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, and of the Cyrenians, and of the Alexandrians, and of those from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and disputed with Stephen. Okay? What this is alluding to, which is a historical fact as well, is that Alexandria, Egypt, right there along with Cyrene right to the west, had multiple synagogues just for them, okay, in their town. In Jerusalem, if you were influential and rich and powerful, you also had a second synagogue in Jerusalem just for you. just for your town, just for your breed of people or whatever. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Because there were enough influential, wealthy people from Alexandria to also have a synagogue of the freedmen. This is a synagogue in Jerusalem, and it's made up of Alexandrians and Cyrenians and from Cilicia and Asia. All right? So this is kind of an elite group of Jews, but notice what they're doing. They're rising up against Stephen, okay? If Simon had not been chosen to carry Jesus' cross, I'm speculating here, but he'd probably be still part of that synagogue that is opposing Stephen, and those are the people who get Stephen stoned, get him killed, right? Interesting, I think. All right? Well, we might have time to at least read the scripture. I don't know if we'll get time to get into this. The next group of people that we're going to see along the way to the cross, this is the only time we have any record of Jesus speaking on the way to the cross. Now, we know that when he gets to the cross, there's seven different passages, 7 different things that he says. But on the way to the cross, the only time we see him talk is this. And what's interesting to me is that in his weakened condition, he gives a very passionate, very vocal, not a short 1 or 2 sentence thing, but a speech, and it's pretty powerful. It says, and a great multitude, this is in Luke chapter 23, it's the only place it is, it's not in any other Gospels. Luke 23, verses 27 through 31, this is called the mourning women. These are the women, most likely hired mourners, okay? When we get to talking about the crucifixion, one of the things we're going to see is that, Jesus is offered this drink, and he refuses, and then later on he's offered a different drink, and he takes that. One of the jobs of local women had taken upon themselves, okay, was to mix a drink with myrrh and frankincense and some other spices and things that were painkillers. And so they would offer this drink to the condemned person on the way to the cross, all right? Now, the soldiers were in total agreement with this, because if you could deaden the senses of the person that you're trying to drive nails then through their hands and feet onto a cross, it made your job a lot easier. So I don't know if they were paid to do this or if they were just doing it because they were compassionate women, but it was a common thing, and the drink was offered by the women. We also know that in that culture, there are women who are paid mourners. Your family pays for people to come and cry at your funeral or whatever. Instead of sending flowers, they send a woman to come wail. Okay, kind of weird, but we saw that with the little girl that Jesus brought back from the dead. Remember that? There were all these paid mourners outside the house, and they mocked Jesus when he said she's not dead, and they made fun of him, said, that's what you think, she really is dead, and he told them to get out of there. And those were women who were paid to come and mourn for the little girl. And that's most likely what these women are. It says, a great multitude of people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him, okay? But look at Jesus' reaction. It gives you the idea, these are not women who have supported Jesus all along, and it's not women who are part of his ministry, women who take care of him. It gives you the idea these are people that don't really even know Jesus, okay? But look what he says. But Jesus, turning to them, said, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? Well, that's a pretty long speech for a man who's lost almost all his blood. Pretty powerful. Yeah. Jesus is still in charge. If you think about it, the only thing he said on the way to the cross, think about all the things he could have talked about. Love your neighbor, right? Worship God with all your soul, might, strength, everything, all of that, right? He could have talked about being compassionate, protect the innocent, because he's innocent. All the things he could have talked about. Well, what subject does he choose? What is this? What? Well, yeah, women in that culture, the highest accolade a woman could get would be to bear children, okay? And for a woman to wish that she didn't bear children, because that's what it means. It says, they'll say, blessed are the barren women, blessed are the ones who don't have children, blessed are the ones who never nursed a baby. In order in that culture, for them to say, those women are lucky, that was huge, because just the opposite was believed in that culture, is that if you didn't have a child, you were ridiculed. So there had to be some terrifically awful event happening to make them say that the women would be blessed if they didn't have kids. He's talking about judgment. Yeah, he's talking about judgment. And the judgment he's talking about, he calls them daughters of Jerusalem. This goes back to exactly what he told the disciples about, that every stone is going to be dropped from this temple. And this whole thing comes true in AD 70, just exactly what he says when Jerusalem is destroyed. And so he's telling them, you better be preparing yourself and thinking about judgment. He says, because if they do this in the greenwood, what will be done in the dry? That was a common colloquial saying, basically. If this kind of stuff can happen when things are going good, what's going to happen when things are going bad? See the difference? Yeah. So he's saying, if they can do this to me, an innocent man, what do you think when Rome is at its peak and doing great, what do you think is going to happen when you guys revolt? When things in Jerusalem are peaceful right now and they can kill an innocent man in front of all these people, what do you think is going to happen when you guys riot next time? And that's exactly what comes true. Okay? And that's the only thing he talked about on the way to the cross. All right, so next week we'll actually get to the cross, and we're going to look at the rest of the people who are players in the drama of the cross next week.